Good morning, everybody. My name is Jean-Louis de Brouwer, and I'm the director of the European Affairs program of the Egmont Institute. I'm very happy to moderate the first session of this webinar, which is co-hosted by the Institut Jacques Delors, the European Policy Center, and the Egmont Institute. As usual, I will start with a few housekeeping remarks. The webinar is recorded and will be made available on the YouTube Egmont channel a couple of hours following our session this morning. We are very happy to have a numerous audience, but we have also a very tight schedule. So when using the chat box to ask questions, either during or after the panelist presentation, I will ask you to be clear and concise so that as a moderator, I can spot easily what the key concern is and pass it to the relevant speaker. I will leave it to my colleague Eleonora Milazzo to conclude this session and to pass the baton to Marie de Zomer and Jérôme Vignon for the second session, which will start at 11:30 sharp after a short health break. 100 days passed since the beginning of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. 100 days of war, 100 days of violences of all kinds. On March the 4th, 2022, following a proposition tabled by the Commission 2 days before, the Council adopted unanimously the implementing decision establishing the existence of a mass influx of displaced persons from Ukraine within the meaning of the Directive of 20th July 2001 on temporary protection. Since then, many things have been written and said about this unprecedented leap forward of the European protection system. Since then, millions of Ukrainians have entered the EU and hundreds of thousands have applied for this regime. Since then, we have witnessed spectacular shows of solidarity in the frontline member states, of course, but also all over Europe. The purpose of this webinar is not to dwell into any of the numerous challenges related to the implementation of temporary protection. It is rather to take a step back, some would say a bird's-eye view on what has been achieved until now, and to do this at a time decision makers and stakeholders at whatever level are confronted with a key question. Are we still dealing with a humanitarian emergency, or should we now move to fully fledged mid to long-term integration and inclusion policies? Let me now turn to our panelists without further ado, panelists for this first session who will help us to better understand where we are at this juncture. Agnieszka Kosovic, you were with us already at the occasion of a first webinar convened by EPC on March the 4th, and you gave them a vibrant but lucid testimony of the incredible solidarity displayed by the Polish civil society. Where are we today, and what is your assessment of what would come now, what would come next, now that, let's say, Polish citizens, like their fellow Europeans, are experiencing the backlash of the economic war against Russia? Agnieszka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you here today. I guess that to briefly answer your already formed questions, in Poland, we are already in a different place that we were even 2-3 weeks ago. And definitely for Poland, the perspective has changed and turned into more long-term or medium-term thinking. What we have observed over the last 3 months, indeed, it was a huge wave of solidarity and spontaneous individual involvement in addressing the situation and providing the humanitarian assistance. Where we are now is a place where we need to shift whatever was installed before. A lot of people, 90% of persons that were here in Poland from Ukraine were housed by private individuals. So we do have group accommodation centers or temporary accommodation centers, but only 10% of the population is housed there. So the key challenge right now is to address the situation where this neighborly assistance or individual help for people has to evolve. And thinking about the key challenges right now, this is what we think about: housing and looking for long-term solutions. People are simply tired. And a lot of questions that we receive in Poland are concerning government approach to the situation, because after this spontaneous wave and very ad hoc response of the society, we need some long-term and systemic solutions. And what we are, I'm afraid to say, facing is lack of this systemic response. What we observe is fatigue, both of the refugees and Polish society. We see growing social tensions. We see incredible increase of prices and costs of living, costs of petrol and everyday goods. I don't know, meat, bread have grown by 30% to 50%. And this increase is fueling concern, basically, of a lot of Polish people. So what we see is, I believe, growing tension, which really calls for systemic approach and systemic solutions that are absent. What we also observe is growing tension over difficult access to many services. For example, Warsaw itself declared that they would need to build 75 schools in order to house the refugee population. I mean, we know that it will not happen by September when the new school year starts. And at the same time, we don't see any systemic solutions being created to accommodate the children that are here. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of school-age children. Access to healthcare becomes an issue. Neighborly relations between Poles and refugees are becoming increasingly tense. We also observe returns. And this brings me to the topic of the temporary protection directive, because this is also where we observe many challenges. People are coming back to Ukraine not only for good or with an intention to stay in Ukraine, but also sometimes to, for example, plant crops, living in rural areas. It is an important moment we faced when you do plant, and a lot of people, this is their motivation to come back. A lot of people go to review their houses or visit husbands or reunite with the family briefly. And this is where the discrepancy between Polish understanding, I guess, and European understanding of temporary protection comes into place and becomes difficult. Because in Poland, before the war, we did have a notion of temporary protection in the local law. So what Poland has done was to activate the form of temporary protection that we had in the national legislation. And this differs in some aspects to the European temporary directive that was adopted. For example, in the European directive, a person has a right to travel for 90 days without losing their rights. The Polish legislation talks about 30 days, and we do face in practice cases of persons that leave to Ukraine for more than 30 days and are unable to return, or are returning but are deprived of the protection provided by the special legislation. So this discrepancy of understanding or specific elements of the law become difficult. Another thing is documentation, because by the Polish legislation, person who is arriving and being protected under temporary protection directive does not receive a document, which is required by the European law. So in practice, we have people who are covered by the legislation, but cannot prove that and cannot, in fact, document the claim or the right to enjoy many rights. And this results, for example, with issues with family reunification or proving how long you are in Poland and since when you enjoy certain set of rights. We also see that the Polish and European understanding of family is important, because the Polish legislation does not cover other family members but by spouses, and when they are not Ukrainian citizens. And this also creates many family tragedies, because families can unite with, or a spouse can unite with a spouse, but, for example, have problem legalizing their children when they are third country nationals, which is also a practical issue. Another concept that is not very well formulated or causes issues is accommodation, because by European understanding of or concept of temporary protection, persons who are provided help should also receive assistance in accommodation. In Poland, in practice, this doesn't happen. So persons who arrive are housed by individuals. The government offered financial assistance to Polish people who host refugees, but in practice, it doesn't function well. And until now, after 3 months, a lot of people have not received any support. So this is far from ideal. And then finally, medical issues also are important, because the directive claims that one should have access to medical help and psychological help. And in practice, in Poland, it means access to the standard system or state system. But then in practice, a lot of people find it very difficult to access their rights or enjoy particularly psychological assistance, which is not so easily accessible in Poland in foreign language. So maybe as first note, I would leave this at that. And I guess that for us, it's super important to mention that this expectation that this spontaneous movement and spontaneous support of a lot of individuals, also foreigners and citizens of France, Germany, Britain, Portugal, and other countries who are coming here for help, is supposed to be replaced by some kind of systemic response that is long-term, that is well thought over, and we are still at the beginning of this road. I can't say, and I don't want to say that the government is inactive, but we just observe that this taking over by the system of what happens in Poland is taking place very, very slow, too slow, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. You immediately raised a certain number of issues that will certainly be further elaborated upon during the first session this morning. Let me now turn to Harlem Desir. Harlem, you are leading the largest humanitarian non-governmental organization worldwide. The International Rescue Committee is present and active both in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. Indeed, one should not lose sight of the fact that the humanitarian emergency starts in Ukraine with much more internally displaced persons than people having fled abroad. The humanitarian response was criticized for its weaknesses in the early days of the Russian aggression, but things seem to have improved since then. Could you share with us your assessment of the situation as it stands, both in and out Ukraine, and the challenges to be met in the months to come? Harlem, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, for the invitation to this panel. Very happy to join the colleagues. So this is the day of the 100 start of 100 days since the start of the war, and it has been 100 days of suffering for the people inside Ukraine and for all those obliged to leave the country, and also 100 days of impunity regarding the crimes against civilians, the destruction of civil infrastructure, health facilities, for example. So you're right, Jean-Louis, to remind us that inside Ukraine, the humanitarian crisis is dire, with needs continuing to rise. I think that it was yesterday that President Zelensky mentioned 12 million internally displaced people. There is, under our estimation, more than 15 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance inside the country. That means roughly 30% of Ukraine population, and the continuation of the conflict in the east and the south has led to a lot of problems of access to food, access to water, to other essential supplies. The health system is crumbling as hospitals begin to run out of medicine and electricity in some parts of the country, especially in eastern Ukraine. And so there is a need of ensuring that all the population have access, especially this internally displaced population, to all these basic needs and services. to safety, of course, to information, to accommodation. I've been visiting Ukraine. We have teams in different parts of the country providing cash assistance, material assistance, working with local Ukrainian organization in the health system, also with local authorities. And the needs there are growing. The international mobilization, especially the one of the European Union through ECHO, is also very important. But as Agnieszka said, the conflict is continuing. And so I think we must be sure to be able to continue to provide this support in very difficult condition in some parts of the country. You also recall that we also have been deploying humanitarian assistance in neighboring countries, including Poland, working with local partners, also in Moldova, but also in other parts of Europe, like Germany, or even outside of the European Union, in the UK, to support the integration, the welcome of refugees. And regarding the implementation of the Temporary Protection Directive, I would say that, of course, what has been done is really wonderful. First, as it was said by Agnieszka, because of the civil society and local authority spontaneous mobilization, but also it's true because of the legal safety, which was brought by the Temporary Protection Directive. You ask us about the differences of implementation. We see a lot of differences. For example, 12 member states have decided to extend the protection to all Ukrainians, including those who arrived before the start of the war, while some others have not done this. There is differences in the access to health care, for example. For some member states, it has been provided immediately that all refugees, all families can have access to the whole health system, while in some countries, it has been restricted only to the younger part of the population and to some part of the healthcare. The support in terms of allowance of what is provided in terms of cash to the Ukrainian is different from a country to another. The way are treated the non-Ukrainian who were inside Ukraine is also different in some countries. And for example, we have problem in Hungary with a restrictive interpretation of the directive, while the European Commission have asked to have a wide, an extensive interpretation of the directive. Agnieszka also mentioned the access to housing, and I very much agree with her on the fact that in Poland, but not only in Poland, even if there was a really extraordinary movement of solidarity and welcoming refugees at home, for example, when I was in Berlin, I was really impressed by the number of people I happened to meet for diverse reasons who all welcome the family at home from Ukraine. But at a point, it's clear that it is not sustainable. And so there is a need, I think, for all member states, with the support of the European institution, to ensure that there will be a sustainable way of integration. It's the same for school. I mean, in general, scholarization has been provided, even if there is also some families of Ukraine who want their children to stay in touch with the Ukrainian school system with online course. But it's clear that there will be a need of support to all these schools who welcome Ukrainian children and who will need some kind of technical assistance and training for the teacher. It's the same for access to the labor market. And here I want to insist on an idea which for us is very important, is to consider that integration has to start from day one, which means that you must ensure that not only legal safety, but also access to right, access to school, access to health, access to job integration and training can be provided for day one. And this is very important also for a reason which is linked to the fact that, as you know, the vast majority of the Ukrainian refugees are women and children, and that there is an issue of protection at stake. There is vulnerability here in the fact that it's mainly on voluntary and individual and civil society effort that the concrete welcome has been based so far. So it's very important, even to continue to encourage the spontaneous movement, but to be sure that it's not made at the detriment of the refugees, and that there is no human trafficking and exploitation of the refugee, that there is a very strong institutional environment which is put in place. Then I also agree with what Agnieszka said about the specificity of this refugee situation, where people are sometimes returning for a while in Ukraine. And we must be, if the conflict is to continue, ready to adjust also to this reality. I've seen this in Chisinau, for example, in Moldova, where you have people, you know, sometimes every month or week, even going to Odessa and coming back, or reunify, or some part of the family trying to reunify in Odessa for a few days, or on the contrary, people from Odessa coming to Chisinau and returning to Odessa as long as it is possible to do it. We also have seen everywhere, it's the case, especially for the internally displaced people, but also for the refugees who are in Europe, the need of a very important psychosocial support. People are traumatized, people, of course, especially when they had to leave places where there is still fighting, or where there have been important shellings and fighting, and leaving behind their children, their fathers, or elderly. I remember people of Mykolaiv, for example, when we were in Chisinau, and they get news, or they try to every day by phone, but they live in a permanent tension and pressure, not to speak about those who have seen their cities and their houses destroyed, their neighbor or family killed. Here, I think also the need of support will be really important on a long time. And so that's why we must be able to have in mind, as you said, the necessity to first here in Europe, because we are here to improve the way we implement and we coordinate in implementing the temporary protection directive, but also to keep in mind the fact that the needs inside Ukraine will continue to be very important.
Thank you very much, Arlen. It's impressive to see how these two first interventions are responding to each other and highlighting issues of common concern. Let me now turn, but before I turn maybe to Sophie, let me invite participants not to hesitate, start asking questions in the chat box now. There is already one, so that we could follow up swiftly immediately after the panel with a conversation with you, because I'm sure that what we are hearing now will certainly raise a certain number of concerns, questions, remarks, so don't hesitate and don't wait until for the end of the panel. Sophie Maganis. Surprisingly, the HCR was utterly defiant at the time of the adoption of the Temporary Protection Directive, as it saw it as a possible threat to the international protection principles as enshrined in international law. 20 years later, the HCR welcomed its first implementation, but still questions remain. What is, as of today, HCR's assessment of the way temporary protection is implemented in member states? And we've heard already that there were divergences between member states. And moreover, does HCR have any view on the possible knock-on effect of the temporary protection on the well-functioning or not so well-functioning of the normal asylum system in the member states? Sophie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, and thank you to the Egmont Institute and to the EPC for having us today. It's very timely to be having this event, as you mentioned, on the 100-day anniversary of the start of the war, and very good that we take this opportunity to take stock. And thank you for the questions you put to me, Jean-Louis, and I look forward to responding to those. Indeed, I think the decision by EU member states to agree to the proposal by the Commission to trigger the Temporary Protection Directive was really a massive moment in the European Union and in the history of asylum and protection within the European Union. As we all know, there was a proposal indeed to scrap the Temporary Protection Directive under the Pact, which was published by the Commission in September 2020. So I think for many of us, the idea that this directive would be triggered in 2022 would have been unthinkable, even in the months prior to February 22. So it was quite a momentous thing that this directive was actually used and brought in. And we, as you mentioned, very much welcomed the implementation of this directive as a very good means to respond to the significant movement of people from Ukraine, refugees from Ukraine into the European Union. And as we remarked at the time as UNHCR, it was the fastest moving refugee crisis. So this was the right instrument, we felt, to put in place to deal with it, and to have, in principle at least, one common set of rights and one common protection status that all of the refugees fleeing Ukraine could benefit from. Just a couple of good positive things to talk about in terms of the Temporary Protection Directive, and then I'll turn to some challenges and also the interplay with the asylum system that you mentioned. In terms of the positive elements, shortly after the Temporary Protection Directive was triggered and put in place, the Commission established a solidarity platform, bringing together EU member states to meet on a weekly basis and to try and ensure that the directive was implemented fully and in a positive way. And that platform has worked well and has encouraged states to share information and to try and work together in a way that they have found difficult to do in recent years. A 10-point action plan was published by the Commission, which also clearly set out some of the key issues that member states should focus on to overcome the difficulties in implementing the plan. And currently the Solidarity Platform is focusing on contingency planning. So the Commission is encouraging all member states to share their ideas and their plans, so the proper contingency planning is put in place for the coming weeks and months, including to try and address some of the challenges that Agnieszka and Harlem have clearly set out about the gaps that are currently there at the moment. People may also have seen that the Commission launched a platform for the exchange of information on beneficiaries of temporary protection. That happened on the 31st of May. And the idea there is to try and ensure that people have access to their rights even when they move within the European Union. That's just been launched, so we'll have to see how that works out. In terms of the challenges, I think they have been well addressed already by Agnieszka and Harlem in some detail. We see some divergences where, unfortunately, in some countries or in relation to some rights, refugees from Ukraine are finding it difficult to access those rights. And there are two very good studies that have been recently published, which provide detail on the divergences of access to rights in EU member states and even beyond. There's an OECD study on rights and support for Ukrainian refugees in receiving countries, and the Fundamental Rights Agency, FRA, has released a report called The War in Ukraine: Fundamental Rights Implications Within the EU. And both of those reports set out easy to read tables which explain what the differences are in the different EU member states. But key amongst those divergences are the length of the protection offered, which we've heard, and the amount of financial support, access to language training. I think there's a lot of vocational training in member states, but in some member states, access to language support is less available. So the first challenge is the divergences. The second is moving to longer term support at a time of uncertainty. We're 100 days into this war, but it's still very unclear what's going to happen. Will things get worse? Will millions more people arrive in the EU? Or will the contrary happen, with people continuing to return to Ukraine? So it's very difficult for us to plan at that time. And perhaps one guiding plan should be what the OECD refers to as dual intent solutions. So focusing on integration supports within the European Union that will help people access education, housing, but will also enable them or capacitate them to return when the time comes. So I think that's possibly one way to handle this moment of uncertainty. A third challenge is managing fatigue and the summer season coming. You know, unfortunately, there's been a lot of accommodation of refugees from Ukraine in hotel accommodation, and hoteliers in some countries are moving to free up that space in order to deal with the tourist season. So a lot more effort needs to go into now to dealing with fatigue in the private sector, where people are accommodating people in their homes. On the funding issue, the European Commission has disbursed 3.5 billion euros of the 17 billion euros in the care package to EU member states. So Poland has received nearly 600 million euros under that. I think there's a lack of awareness about that funding that's been paid out. And also there's a challenge with that funding trickling down to the local level. Perhaps if we could raise awareness about that, it might reduce some of the social tensions, with the sense that people feel that there's support, but we need to see that money moving down to municipalities and to NGOs. And finally, another challenge is dealing with pendular return. Refugees need to have information on their rights if they go back to Ukraine. Can they go to Ukraine, come back to EU member states? Will their protection still be there? And I think we have to take a very flexible approach to this pendular movement. And finally, on the question that you had raised, Jean-Louis, I think we've seen a very small number of people accessing the asylum system, refugees from Ukraine. They are largely accessing temporary protection. I think the real challenge for us is to try and avoid a situation where we have a heavily invested in support system for refugees from Ukraine and a neglected system for the other groups of asylum seekers. And what we really want to do as UNHCR is capitalize from some of these excellent things that have happened under temporary protection and try and make sure that some of those benefits can also be afforded to refugees who are recognized through the regular asylum system. So we want to see a bit more cohesion between these two different frameworks rather than keeping them apart. There's a few other things I might say on solidarity if we have a chance during the Q&A, but I'll leave it for now. Thanks, Jean-Louis.
Thank you very much, Sophie. We shall certainly come back during the Q&A on this issue. By the way, Sophie, one of the participants is asking whether it would be possible for you to share the links related to the two studies that you mentioned. So that would be highly appreciated, I think. Catherine Mullard, through its network of civil society organizations, the European Consortium on Refugee and Exile has been able to monitor the implementation of temporary protection. This is reflected in particular in your regularly updated information sheet on access to territory, international protection procedures, and reception conditions for people fleeing the war in Ukraine in European countries. You are therefore in a unique position, building further on what we heard from Sophie, to provide us with an assessment of what worked and what didn't in the operationalization of this never tested until now EU protection framework. Catherine, over to you.
And yes, thank you very much. So I'm going to base my comments on that ongoing monitoring that we're carrying out and the information we're receiving from the network of members, as you've rightly mentioned, plus partners, lawyers, and a lot of contact with people directly leaving from Ukraine, and so direct experience. So from our perspective, we've said from the beginning, the activation of the TPD is something extremely positive, and I would really challenge anybody who could deny that. And one of the reasons for that is precisely because it should allow for a transition towards a structural response. And despite its name, the advantage of this instrument is the security it provides for people and the member states, and the fact that people are not stuck for months or even years in status determination processes. And the principle of integration from day one can finally be applied. And I don't think that makes it less likely that people will return when they want to. The level of inclusion within societies and the willingness to return have a complex relationship. So despite this aspiration for transition to, let's say, a structural integration of the Ukraine response, we can say that there are at least 6 EU member states that are in situations of pretty acute humanitarian emergency. And that's just the reality of the situation. And then, of course, beyond that, Moldova and, of course, Ukraine itself. And there we see typical challenges of any humanitarian displacement emergency. Questions of funding, raising money, absorbing money, avoiding corruption and misuse of money, getting money to the right people, logistical challenges, coordination between all the different actors involved, NGOs, governments, international organizations, risk of trafficking and other exploitation. And I think while we would hope for the kind of transition to a longer term structural support, the reality may be that a situation of humanitarian emergency persists. So that has to be dealt with by the good principles and practices that we are aware of. And what we see now is that European and international humanitarian providers that previously worked elsewhere in the world are now deploying and working in these situations. How to encourage the switch away from this emergency? I've noted a number of points based on our monitoring. The first is at the level of scope of protection. We're urging as wide as possible interpretation and application of the temporary protection status. So there are member states that have used their discretion, which was encouraged by the Commission, to widen the scope of protection under the TPD to beyond the categories that are for which it's mandatory to be used. So there are 10 that apply a wider scope to third country nationals. There are 8 that apply a wider personal scope to Ukrainians. There are 7 member states at our count who've widened the temporal scope to those who left before the invasion. On the other hand, according to our monitoring, there are 6 member states where their application is narrower than the scope provided for in the decision. And that is unlawful. So that's something that should be addressed. And wide scope means, of course, that people have status and security. That in turn means that they're not then part of a humanitarian emergency situation. They have the chance of inclusion and independence. Otherwise, what we're seeing is that people who aren't falling within the scope are becoming caught up in very acute emergency situations, I mean, living on the streets and so on. On the other hand, I would also underline that it's in the interests of the member states to apply a wide scope, because what we're seeing are time-consuming questions of recognition and challenging denial of recognition. So legal challenges that centre on people being denied temporary protection. There isn't the time to spend on those kind of matters. So the administrative burden would be easier if a wide scope was applied, would be lessened, I should say. A second issue related to this is recognition of documents. There we would urge more guidance on document recognition, including of electronic ID and electronic documents. A third related element is this question of loss of status on re-entry. I think it's essential that this be dealt with. And Agnieszka in particular, but also Sophie, have mentioned that there is, because of the proximity, because of the particularity of this situation, we are looking at a different kind of situation in terms of return to the country. And it will create both insecurity, humanitarian problems, and administrative burden on the member states if people lose status, if they've gone into Ukraine and out again for certain periods of time, or if they move to another member state. This is some freedom of movement should not be creating loss of status. On the registration level, there are still practical challenges. Here we would underline the need for speeding up, in particular, of residence permits. And this is at the moment a major blockage in terms of accessing rights. It's simply just not the delays in the issuance of the documents that people need when they're trying to access services. And in terms of access to rights, I think this has been well explained by the others. According to our sort of review of the whole situation, there are serious problems, as one would imagine, at the level of housing and also at medical care, particularly for vulnerable groups. But we would expect the other rights, the questions of education, access to the labour market, to become more of a challenge. It's a chronological question. And final points in terms of this transition. Clearly, maintaining political and public support is crucial. And for this, we would also urge the support, necessary practical support going beyond the state. And of course, it is primarily state responsibilities, and we completely agree with the other panelists who are underlining that in some cases states are not necessarily putting in place and fulfilling their responsibilities. And on the other hand, we need to maintain, at least in the medium term, if not the long term, this provision of support from civil society, from volunteers, but also from EU agencies and from others, and indeed expand this. And so that means mandates, funding, and so on going beyond the state. And this in turn can help reinforce public support. Public support is incredibly fragile in every displacement crisis. And all it will take is a few high profile, serious situations. It would take things like ongoing situations of destitution. There's all kinds of things that undermine public support, and having wider societal response and support for the people fleeing is part of this. We would underline that maintaining political unity on the security side, but also in the displacement response is crucial. And unfortunately, I think the Hungarian election creates a risk factor here, and we should, I think, for the EU institutions, maintaining that unity, sometimes in the face of what we might call Trojan horse member states, is crucial. And more even geographic distribution, people can't be forced to move on. I think that is a principle that should remain, but there is more that can be done to encourage and support onward movement. And not just at the level of facilitating travel, but also giving guarantees that people are going to be able to return to Ukraine, and may even have funded return support, assisted voluntary return when the time is right. We see that people are staying closer to the Ukrainian borders, which we understand. I mean, it's a natural reaction, particularly given the uncertainties, but people may move further if they know that that is not going to hamper their prospects of eventually returning elsewhere in Europe, but also Canada. I think strong guarantees and even financial can be provided. And I'll conclude just by saying that the impact on the wider asylum system is a crucial question. We don't want to see a situation where we have consolidation of a two-tier system. The TPD is a SEAS instrument. It's there to relieve pressure on the wider asylum system and to act as a safety valve. It shouldn't be used to undermine or to justify the further dismantling of asylum systems. The long-term response to this can be best supported by ensuring that adequate resources are in asylum and migration systems. It's often the same people who are managing the Ukraine response who are managing wider asylum systems. Any kind of crisis in the wider asylum system is going to be problematic. And there's a lot of emerging lessons that could be more widely applied. The advantages of quick access to status, the advantages of ensuring that those entitled to protection have rapid inclusion through access to their rights. Questioning some of the concerns about freedom of movement, which actually is being encouraged in this process. Family reunification can even have advantages for states when it's facilitated. And I think we have to rethink the proposals, the asylum reform proposals that go in the exact opposite direction of the response to this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Again, a lot of points on which we'll probably come back during the Q&A session or during the second session this morning. We have a good 30 minutes for the Q&A, which is right. Thanks a lot to all our panelists for having basically stick to the time limit that we had asked you to respect. I have already, I would say, 3 sets of questions. and I would take them in the order they reached us. The first one have to do with one point that was raised amongst others by Alan in his presentation, and that's integration into the labor market and the centrality of the challenges around access to work and access to the labor market. But let me ask this question in a bit of a provocative way. Isn't there a contradiction? Isn't there a tension? Isn't there a tension there between, on one end, the fact that indeed Ukrainians, according to the Temporary Protection Directive, should be given access to the labor market, and that this access should be facilitated, that making use of the Ukrainian talent could even benefit the economies of the receiving countries. But at the other end, that also these talents could be needed, hopefully sooner than later, to help for the reconstruction of their country. Also, you can see this kind of tension in the position of some employers who are hesitating to hire Ukrainians who could very quickly leave and go back to their country of origin. So my first set of questions would be about how to handle this challenge of integration into the labor market. Maybe Alan, you want to chip in first because you were the one raising this question, but Sophie and others might also further elaborate on that. Over to you.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. Yes, I will be interested to hear the answers from others. First, what we have learned from many experience of welcoming refugees everywhere is that every week or month that you lose in the integration process, being scolarization, I mentioned it, but also training and access to the labor market, the more difficult it is on a long run. So really, we think that in terms of the good integration of these 5 million new refugees in Europe, which is a number we would never have imagined Europe will be able to welcome, but it has been possible. But it has been possible so far because of the goodwill of a lot of people, and because we have created the legal framework with the temporary directive protection, which make it possible for them just to stay here and to have access to certain rights. But if we really want to success, as this will be continuing for a long time, we need to invest a lot and to coordinate and to put the necessary support to the people, to the families, so that they can really integrate all aspects of our social life, including the labor market. I don't think this will be a loss for their origin country, Ukraine, because when they will be returning, they will have continued to be trained, to get skilled. They will be in a better personal also position. For sure, there will be a lot of very different situations. You will have people who will be concerned by this pendular movement, but some other people will be more stable, I would say, in our countries. So that's right that we need a lot of flexibility, as Sophie said, but flexibility doesn't mean instability, doesn't mean a lack of capability to be really rooted in the place where you have decided to stay. So I don't think there is really a contradiction, even if you're right to say that we have to have this in mind. I think it's an articulation in a way with diverse dimension of this new situation of refugees who are to stay here in Europe for a long time, but also to keep a very strong link with our country of origin at the same time.
Thank you very much, Alan. Sophie, this resonates a little bit with what you said about this flexible integration scenario. By the way, this could also be applied to housing, because when you think about the situation of the private landlord, they could hesitate to rent a house or an apartment to Ukrainians, even Ukrainians who could afford for this rent, simply because of the lack of potential lack of stability of those renting their houses and apartment. But please, Sophie, over to you.
Thanks, Jean-Louis. And I think you pointed to some clear challenges that are there when it comes to the uncertainty question. The uncertainty will provide some level of chilling effect for landlords and for employers, not knowing how long people will stay. And I think that is a reality that you're pointing to, that is there. On the other hand, I think when it comes to integration in the labour market, it I think also supports the longer term possibility for people to return by keeping the skills of those people alive. And I think we have seen you know, some terrible situations where asylum seekers in the EU have not been allowed to access work for long periods of time, and their skills become redundant, or they find it difficult to re-enter the labour market. So keeping those skills alive is an important a factor to facilitate return when the time comes. I suppose additionally then, for people who have a perspective to return, which is from what we understand from our, you know, intention check-ins with Ukrainian refugees, the vast majority want to go back as soon as possible when it's safe. Having employment and being able to possibly save some money or indeed invest in their lives in Ukraine, for example, the agricultural example that we are given, these are all positive factors that will also enhance the possibility for people to return. So this really hits that dual intent idea that we have, that supporting integration in the labour market will not necessarily provide a chilling effect on people to return. On the contrary, it can support return. And we also see a huge interest in the private sector in recruiting refugees. And maybe that's one way to overcome the issue that you have raised, Jean-Louis, about the very uncertain nature of the length of the employment. There are a lot of big private sector companies, human resources companies like Adecco and Manpower, who are very keen to employ refugees. And perhaps they can also be encouraged to come up with innovative ways to retain people through modern working methods when they return to Ukraine, if that's possible. So maybe that's one way to overcome that. And finally, maybe to mention the efforts that are underway by a lot of actors to support access to the labour market. We see the Commission as well, which has done a lot of work on the talent pool idea. Or originally that was very much focused on pathways. So the idea that people would be supported to come to the European Union to enter a job. Now those efforts are also being oriented to try and help refugees access the labour market through using the Commission's contact with the private sector and talent pools to achieve that. And we also see at national level in Greece, in Italy and Spain, a lot of initiatives happening at national level to try and link refugees up with the labour market. So I think those are positive things that do away a little bit with the tension, but nonetheless, the uncertainty does cause problems. And we see it very much, for example, in the education sector, where parents are still delaying the decision on whether to enroll their children in school, waiting to see what happens. So unfortunately, the waiting to see what happens element, we can't get over for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I see Catherine and Agnieszka on the same issue. Catherine first and then Agnieszka.
Thank you. On labour market, just two points. I think a link can also be made with the question of a more even geographic distribution. So for here, we've suggested exploring explicit connection between employment in other countries and reconstruction assistance in Ukraine. So it's something, for instance, for certain member states, but also for Canada, that a package which ensures some sort of training and employment during the time that the person is out of the country, but then links it with the reconstruction assistance, which is already being promised, even though everything is unpredictable and it may be years, but that debate is already happening. And a second point is that I think here there are probably also useful lessons for the wider asylum system. One of our concerns about labour market inclusion relates to the increasing use of precarious protection statuses. And here we see, and we have a useful debate about the need for secure status and for solid content of protection in the sense of the duration of stay, for instance. So people are more likely to be employed if they're in a member state where the member state has decided to go beyond the council decision and offer 2 years residence rights rather than the mandatory 1 year. If we look at the wider asylum system, the increasing use, for instance, of subsidiary protection, including for Syrians and other people who are likely to be displaced for the long term is something that undermines the possibility of inclusion if subsidiary protection is accompanied by weaker duration residence rights, for instance, and weaker security of status. So I think that's something to take and apply.
Thank you very much. Agnieszka, over to you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to bring another kind of approach to the topic, and point out that 2/3 of the people that we have in Poland, for example, are women with children, and 1/3 of them have 2 and more children. And what we observe is very heavy link between the labor market and childcare. And very often it is lack of childcare or inadequate childcare available here that prevents people from entering the labor market, but also that provoke sometimes return decisions. So we do have in touch families who are unable to take care of the children and work in Poland, find it impossible to survive basically, and decide to come back to Ukraine, not because of protection, safety, or well, safety perception of Ukraine as a safe country for them now, but because of lack of other options. And also trying to join Sophie in positive thinking, I would like to mention a few warm words about the business, because what we see in Poland is also unprecedented involvement of business. We do meet companies, for example, who created evacuation systems for families of their employers, and in fact, create de facto company integration programs, providing support to hundreds of people that they have evacuated and are in charge of, or integrate them as business. So this involvement of business and dedication of business is, I think, unheard of. What we also see is that the labor market becomes an area of intra-Ukrainian tensions as well, because this discrepancy in access to the labor market to those that have fled Ukraine after the 24th and before the 24th is drastically different. What we also observe is bitterness among the Ukrainians who have fled after the war, because people judge each other on how much justified their own fleeing was. And when we see a lot of bitterness between the people who flee the regions that were attacked and are bombed and are indeed destroyed, and those who have fled, if you can say that, safe areas of Ukraine. And we see a lot of bitter feelings and a lot of tensions within the Ukrainian community on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. I will stay with you for the second set of questions, which have to do with the availability and accessibility of EU financing. This was pointed at by Sophie. Certainly, I mean, a lot of announcements were made by the EU institutions about sizable money. But the question is mainly, how can we secure that this money at the end reaches those who actually need it on the ground, because they are on the front line of the reception system in member states, whether they are frontline member states or other member states. Agnieszka, you certainly must have a view about this, taking into account your experience in Poland. And then I will turn to Sophie and other panelists if they want to add or comment on this.
There is a saying that if you don't know why things happen, it's probably because of money. And I think that this financial aspect is something that is my least favorite in this entire situation, I have to say. What we observe is that money becomes a tool in political discussions and political internal politics, basically, of Poland. Before the war, and of course also now, the central government represents a different political opinion than the local governments and municipalities. And it is a heated conflict, to say, I don't know how diplomatic this is, but it does affect the trust, the cooperation, and also the flow of money. So we do see that many municipalities in practice are not provided smoothly funding by the government. We do hear from municipalities that have not been refunded a penny for the last 3 months, and at the same time they were the ones in charge, and it was mentioned already, of providing first aid and creating the assistance. So this lack of smooth flow of money is an issue. Also, acknowledgement, I think, of receiving the EU funding itself is an issue. For many months and weeks, the government was claiming that EU does not support Poland in addressing the current crisis. And there were very numerous declarations of the government about non-funding. And during her recent visit, Ylva Johansson claimed openly how much money was released and when to Poland, and itself it was a surprising news to many municipalities. Also, NGOs are not the favorite partner of the Polish government, and we do have many fields of disagreements. For example, the Belarusian border, because it's something we tend to forget nowadays with hundreds of thousands of people arriving to Poland from Ukraine. We still have a continuing crisis on the Belarusian Polish border, and the situation of this Belarusian section is an issue of strong disagreement between the government and the NGOs. So again, this discrepancy of perception of the situation, also of the asylum system, which was mentioned, or undermining the asylum system or standards of human rights protection, are a huge issue where we disagree, and the flow of money from the government to the NGO community is very unstable, uneven, and very often politically motivated. So this is what we observe. Does it answer your question somewhat? Yes.
Definitely, but from a broader perspective, I mean, maybe Sophie, as you yourself into that this challenge of the availability of EU funding, do you have some overview about that? And Catherine and Alain might also wish to further elaborate on this.
Yes, thanks a lot, Jean-Louis. And I put into the chat a link to the page on the European Commission's website on support for Ukraine, where they list the amounts that have been paid out of the 3.5 billion. They list the amounts that have been paid out to member states so far. So I mentioned the amount to Poland earlier, 560 million or thereabouts, and other figures to the other member states. So, I mean, what is happening is that this package, the 17 billion of what are called care funds, and there's more information on that link of what those funds are. Those funds are there, and the 3.5 billion has been paid out. But like Agnieszka says, I think the level of awareness at national level in countries about those funds is very low. We would hear similar feedback from our own representatives and people in countries that there's a very low level of awareness about those funds being paid. And member states have called on the Commission to make this funding very easy. So there's a concept of a one-stop shop where, you know, an envelope of money is given to member states, and then it's those member states that decide what happens with that money. There's a separate regime for the smaller funding envelope, which is the AMIF one, which many of us will be familiar with, which is the Asylum Migration Integration Funds. And there are certain safeguards and rules, let's say, where member states are constrained on what they need to spend that money on. And there's also requirements for them to consult with civil society and have some consultations on what will be in their program. And there's a consultation process with the Commission. So there's a level of control and engagement. Whereas I think with this funding, perhaps given the speed of things, the emergency response, and the money has been given to the member state, and it seems that the level of control then that the Commission and other actors have is very low. So I think it's useful, it's a very important area for think tanks, for academics, for NGOs to be engaging in, to make sure that there's awareness about that money, and to try and encourage states to quickly expedite the dispersal of that money to the people who are incurring the costs, which of course is the local level municipalities, NGOs and others. And we as UNHCR are engaging a lot with municipalities, with regions, with mayors, and trying to encourage and facilitate their engagement in relation to this. But yeah, it's not going to be easy, but I think we really need to ramp up the efforts now, given that this first tranche has been paid out. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I mean, we still have 10 minutes to go, and I definitely would like to leave a few moments to Eleonora to draw some conclusion of this initial exchange of view. So I would like to conclude by pointing to your attention two sets of issues which were highlighted by the questions that we received. The first one is what you referred to, Catherine, as the risk of a two-tier approach or two-tier asylum system with growing discrepancies, if not discrimination, between Ukrainians under temporary protection and those still in the, between inverted comma, normal asylum or protection pipeline. The second set of issue is about schooling and access to the school system. It was raised by many of you, including by Arlem. It's a classical debate. I remember having witnessed this kind of discussion at the time concerning the specific curriculum that should be designed or not for Syrian children received in Turkey. So the question is basically, when the time will come in September for the school year to begin, should the Ukrainian children be integrated into the local schooling system with following the local curriculum, including learning a language which is foreign to them, or should they be in a way allowed to keep a link with their culture, with their national schooling system, so that indeed, I mean, when time comes, return and reintegration into their communities or origin would be facilitated. So these would be the two questions or challenges I would like us to elaborate upon within the 10 minutes which are still remaining before I pass the floor to Eleonora. Who wants to take the one or the other? Please, over to you. Alan, please.
Yes, Jean-Louis, those are very important questions. The first one is how we use the experience of this crisis, how we take the best of what we have learned. I think it was Catherine mentioning this, for the reform of the existing asylum system. I mean, we should consider that we should never build camp again. The situation where at the same time where we are doing this very important effort of welcoming 5 million refugees from Ukraine, we still have camps with refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia in one member state, in Greece, is absolutely absurd. Like if we will not be able to welcome 160,000 people who are still there in this country, we are able to do it. So, because this crisis demonstrated that what is at stake is not the number, is the political will, is the way we organize ourselves, is of course to get the support in the population. But it's mainly about organizing the condition for legal safety, social integration, and so on. So that's very important. I think it should drive the rethinking of the asylum system, the discussion on the new pact, the way to accelerate also the treatment of the demand of asylum seekers. The sooner they have a status, the better it is. And even now, with the situation of the temporary directive, the temporary protection directive, we have to think, for example, of the transition to a permanent situation. In Germany, since the 1st of June, since this week, now progressively, all Ukrainian refugees will shift to a permanent situation, which is better for access to child allowance, to social system, health system, etc. Regarding scholarization, I think even if it will be complicated because it was said that some families wants to keep a link with the Ukrainian system, online course and so on, really the principle should be the scholarization in the local school system. And this in principle is in place, is all member states, but as you say, it's in September that it will be really key to check that it is done. I hope that the Solidarity platform will help in general to share best practices, and that one of the conclusions will be that we will support all member states for not only the scholarization of the children, but also for scholarization of for students, for example. And again, I want to say, because we mentioned the two-tier system, that there is still at stake the treatment of non-Ukrainian. In some member states, for example, students who were studying in Ukraine, but non-Ukrainian citizens are allowed to get into the university system. It's, for example, the case in France. I wish, and I think it's very important to ensure that here too, there will be a really equality of treatment. But it should be an equality of treatment in general for all the third national who were in Ukraine and were obliged to flee from the same atrocity and war, and who are now refugees in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harlem. This is a very clear-cut message. Thank you. On these two issues, Catherine and maybe Agnieszka and Sophie, a couple of final comments and remarks, and then I'll pass the floor to Eleonora for the conclusion of this session.
Yes, and as I said in my opening comments, I think it's imperative that the TPD is seen as part of the wider asylum system, and that this risk of discrimination, as you called it, Jean-Louis, is avoided, as well as the kind of bitterness that Agnieszka mentioned that exists, of course, within different groups of people having left Ukraine. There is great and I think understandable anger and frustration among asylum applicants and in other communities of people who have sought or who've been granted protection in Europe. And generally what we hear, I mean, also from our colleagues here, Afghan or Syrian or other nationalities, that people are pleased that this positive response has been afforded in some senses, despite the challenges in implementation in the case of Ukraine. But there is a stark contrast with the treatment and approach towards others. And I think that a first point would be just to look at the differences in the model and say, well, could this model of response be more widely applied? So here we're seeing, for instance, allowing and facilitating access at borders to those who need protection. That certainly the proposals on the table, but also contemporary practice is often about denying access. So there's one change to be made. Seeing the advantages of actually making it easy to rapidly get a protection status. And again, we see proposals that introduce incredibly complex and, in our view, unworkable changes on the procedural side that will delay accessing a procedure and create many complications. It is the case that the majority of those arriving in Europe do have protection needs, as courts will find eventually. So facilitating that would be useful. We also see this question of freedom of movement. So again, freedom of movement is not just being encouraged, it's actually being financed and facilitated. A contrast with the tendency to contain people at borders and to deny onward movement regardless of the costs and the consequences and the disproportionate responsibility for certain member states. So rethinking the model based on looking at, in a time of emergency, what actually works, what actually helps Europe, I think is important. And this has allowed management of a far larger number of arrivals than some of the other situations that were presented as a crisis, but were eminently manageable. So we would argue putting resources into making the system function at the level of reception procedures, and of course the ongoing responsibility sharing question is so important. As a final point on that, I would argue that this is not just about the legal model. It's, as always, it's about political choice. And the strategy here was to invoke the TPD, to go ahead and to try to avoid a crisis. And I think this was based on the understanding that any kind of disunity, any kind of panic, any kind of paralysis would play directly into the hands of Vladimir Putin and have security and military implications. But having that kind of crisis and disunity in any situation also creates risks, disadvantages, and undermines the EU. So I think what we see here is that the EU can manage when the decision is taken to manage. So in more cases, that should be the approach, and avoiding this sense of crisis that just overly politicizes things. As a very final point, I see there was a question on Hungary, and I'm controversially just going to answer that. There is the ongoing question of ensuring unity among the member states in the response to displacement. And we can see that certain member states have a different approach towards Russia. They may be more supportive, they may be unwilling to take a hard line on some of the proposals. That's just a fact. So that's something that from now on may start to create difficulties. It already is if we look at the council discussions from the last 2 weeks. But I would also say we should also consider the impact of countries where they have deliberately dismantled their asylum systems over the last few years, and also countries where the relationship between the state and civil society on asylum and migration issues is tense and in some cases repressive. All of that is not going to help in the response to this situation. Rather, functioning asylum systems, well-resourced state actors on asylum, but also on inclusion, where there's also been a dismantling of the institutions, agencies, and undermining of civil society. We see the risk of all of that having happened, and there needs to be a re-establishment, rebuilding in very practical ways, everything from provision of legal assistance to direct support to people where the role is beyond that of the state, and an enhanced relationship with the state, at least an ending of attacks on civil society would be helpful.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Again, a powerful message. Yes, we can. I've heard that sometime, somewhere. Agnieszka, Sophie, last words, a few comments on these two issues or other topics that were raised during the session, please.
I feel that Catherine took it very high, her contribution, and I feel like getting you back on the ground a little bit. But I would like to do that. And bringing the discussion a little bit back to the educational and labor issues, that I think that what we have to do is match our understanding or perception of human rights with reality and resources. Resources and functionality are two words that I noted from Catherine's recent contribution, because some things will just have to be developed based on what we have, or on resources that we have. And like I mentioned, these 75 schools in Warsaw that won't be built by September, we just, I think, have to create a system that would allow people access their rights in multiple ways. And for example, right now, kind of bearing in mind common sense at the same time, because for example, in education right now, we have 3 possibilities for children in terms of education. So some children are invited to the regular Polish system. Some people are benefiting from online education from Ukraine or cross-border online. And then we have Ukrainian schools that function in Poland under Ukrainian curriculum, but physically with Ukrainian teachers teaching in Poland. And I think that addressing many needs, we just have to accept multi-choice solutions. So we would have to follow the needs of the people, but address their needs in a way that would propose many solutions or many tools or ways to access their rights. And I think it will be a huge challenge to create those solutions in a way that they indeed meet the basic needs of people. So for example, thinking about online education of children in Ukrainian system, which affects majority of children in Poland. There is a challenge of making sure that they are not excluded from Polish language lessons, that they are provided with psychological assistance, that children with special needs are identified and their needs addressed. So there are many, I think, issues that would need to be built around these general notions or systems in order to ensure that the basic rights are provided. So I guess that this is really a very complex system that we have to develop and not one solution. I think this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. This had to be heard also. And by the way, we are keenly aware, EPC, Jacques Delors and ourselves, that what was missing in the organization of this webinar is the voices of the Ukrainians themselves. But there will be other occasion to try to build on their expectation and what they wish actually. Sophie, please.
Thanks very much, Jean-Louis. On the education point, I've put in the chat as well a link to a paper that the Commission provided on this issue, and the Commission, the Director General of Education, is working on a strategy which will be shared. Important to note, just on the point that you raise about inclusion of Ukrainian refugees in these discussions, on the approach to education, there's been a very close engagement between the Commission and Member States with the Ukrainian Education Ministry. And trying to come to agreed arrangements with the Ukrainian ministry as well. So something will come forward on that. But I think the main issue on inclusion is that when it comes to education, learning is just one part of it. Being involved in a school setting is also for children. It's about social inclusion. It's about emotional support. So our sense is a strategy will be going in that direction, but very much with the inclusion of Ukrainian teachers and making sure that the strategy encompasses that. I think going beyond education, then a key challenge that we have is that as part of the emergency response, we've established quite a few referral mechanisms. For example, UNHCR and UNICEF have set up these blue dots, they're called. They're spaces where children and families can go to get support. Those blue dots, at those blue dots, staff identify people, refugees with particular vulnerabilities, and refer them on then for support. So it's very important that we capacitate the social care services, the mental health services, all of those underlying services in member states, so that when people are referred on, they can actually access support. And I think this is where we come back again to the need for the funding that is coming forward from the Commission to be dispersed and targeted correctly. And it's also very important, perhaps we haven't mentioned too much already, that there's an entire, the entirety of the Commission is involved in this response. And we need to make sure that there's a proper engagement of civil society and other actors with parts of the Commission that we didn't engage with before, such as DG Reform, DG Regio, DG Connect, all of these different Directorate Generals, which might not have been linked in to the asylum migration sector. I think there's a need for that to complete the puzzle. And then just finally, on the issue of solidarity, we understand that the French presidency is trying to arrive at some agreement on how to handle solidarity and relocation in the context of SAR arrivals. This is very important for people arriving after search and rescue events into the European Union in the summer. We'll have to see if they can reach some agreement, but there is a unique opportunity now to perhaps merge those efforts with the efforts that Catherine has spoken about, where we've seen such a shift in the response to supporting onward movement, to supporting the agency of people in need of protection. And maybe we can try and find some synergies between those two events to make some headway on the thorny issue of solidarity in the European Union. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sophie. This is a fantastic introduction to the next session. But before we move to that, I mean, Eleonora, the floor is yours. And my thanks to all the panelists who have been participating to this first session. Thank you very much. Eleonora, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for your very insightful interventions this morning. I think the key takeaway from the discussion for now is that, yes, the time has come for a shift to a long-term strategic and systemic response to displacement for Ukraine, but without losing sight of what is still very much an ongoing, evolving humanitarian emergency, both on the ground in Ukraine and in the EU, with important challenges, as you have discussed, particularly when it comes to social inclusion and the implementation of the TPD. So let me now thank once again our distinguished speakers for their time, and all of you for your engagement so far. We are now going to take a break, and we will reconvene at 11:30 sharp for the next panel, which is going to be on the EU long-term response. So please stay with us and see you in about 6 minutes. Thank you very much.